All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I am Suzanne Bontempo, and I'm joined by the wonderful Charlotte Canner. We are with the Our Water, Our World program. And tonight's program, How to Manage Weeds Safely and Effectively, is sponsored in partnership with the Alameda County-wide Clean Water Program. We're really happy you can be with us this afternoon. Hold on, please. Okay, great. So we're going to go through slides for about an hour, and we are going to review an introduction to the Our Water, Our World program. We're going to review integrated pest management. We're going to discuss what weeds are. We're going to provide you with identification tips. We're going to go through prevention strategies. And we're going to look at effective weed management techniques, and then we're going to also talk about using herbicides, the pesticides we'd use to kill the weeds, and then we'll go through a couple of additional resources, and then of course we'll leave time for your questions at the end. As questions come up, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A. And I've also emailed everyone out a resource page and the outline of our program, so go ahead and find that. This is going to be recorded, and you will be able to find the recording of this webinar on the Clean Water Program Alameda County YouTube channel. All right, so our sponsor this afternoon is the Alameda County-wide Clean Water Program. And this is a program that works to protect Alameda County creeks, wetlands, and the bay from runoff that may carry pollutants into the waterways. Related to gardening, that means avoiding chemicals that can be washed off the lawn and garden, washed off our properties, and into the storm drains by irrigation and rain. You can learn more about the Clean Water Program and sign up for the Clean Water News at cleanwaterprogram.org. When you sign up for the newsletter, this is when you'll get alerts about when our programs are coming up and other events throughout the county that are really fun going around throughout your communities. And we have provided a lot of programs in partnership with the Clean Water Program of Alameda County, and you can see a library of them on their YouTube channel. So if you are new to our programs, you can check out this library to see past programs. Or if you've seen our programs before and you missed a couple, this is the great place to review them, is on their YouTube channel. And so what is Our Water, Our World? What is this program? Well, we are a statewide clean water program. We're also a national award-winning program, and the Our Water, Our World's goal is to bring awareness between pesticides and water quality. So that we do that by explaining how the products that we use around the home and garden, many of them, if they're not eco-friendly or plant-based, if they are synthetic, like synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, they have residual components that actually have lingering effects. And when we have rainwater or any type of water from irrigation or hosing off anything, it moves off our property. It's also taking these pollutants with it that will end up in the storm drain that flow directly to our local waterways without going through a filtration system. So we partner with water pollution prevention agencies and retailers that sell pesticides, and we provide integrated pest management education, which is essentially helping associates that work at these retail establishments, as well as the consumers, the general public. We help them solve their pest problems with a less toxic approach, with the intention of reducing pollutants in the form of pesticides and fertilizers. You can learn more about the Our Water, Our World program at ourwaterourworld.org. And our watersheds, our gardens, and water quality. How is this all related? So a watershed is an area of land that drains or sheds water into a single body of water. Watersheds drain any rainwater or snowmelt that isn't absorbed into the ground into a stream, a creek, a river, any water that then can flow to a larger body of water, such as a reservoir, a lake, wetland, bays, oceans, and so forth. But around our properties, any water that isn't absorbed into the ground is then going to move across our properties and out to a storm drain that goes untreated to the nearest waterway, taking with it pollutants, as I mentioned, those chemicals, pet waste, motor oil, debris, fertilizers, anything that we are actually using around our properties that is going to be synthetic actually can move with that water. So as I mentioned, Our Water World is a program designed to draw that connection between pollutants and the water quality. So just a reminder, whenever we're using products in or around the home, we just like to ask that we look for alternatives that actually won't cause a threat or be a pollutant for our waterways. And as I mentioned, we provide integrated pest management education. So through the lens of integrated pest management, it allows us to address the cause. So when we have a pest problem, we are going to start by asking a few questions, really identifying what is the problem at hand. Oftentimes when we have a pest problem or we have a problem, we see that it's symptoms of something else that's going on. When we are using an integrated pest management approach, we're actually using science-based strategies, and it allows us to look at the system as a whole to really fine-tune and identify what that problem is. A lot of integrated pest management is identifying that pest, but then preventing that pest problem from occurring again. And if we need to take action, the action steps in IPM are called controls. The cultural controls, which is increasing the health of the garden to make the plants happier and healthier, but then discourage pest problems. The mechanical controls are the tools that we use to manage the pest problems, such as weeding tools that we might use, or for other pests, we could use barriers such as gopher baskets to prevent gophers from eating those root zones, or deer fencing to prevent those deer from coming into the gardens. We work with traps such as yellow jacket traps or fly traps, but we could also use sticky traps as monitoring devices. So those are the mechanical controls. And then we also use biological controls, which is inviting in or using living organisms to manage the pests. We're big fans of inviting beneficial insects into the garden. They definitely support and encourage a healthy ecosystem. And then lastly, we would look at chemical controls. When we've exercised all of the other options, we can use chemical controls. We're always going to use the least toxic possible and always as a last resort. And we're going to really show you what that looks like through the lens of weed management and IPM.
All right, thank you for that intro, Suzanne. So yeah, we're going to now we're going to take what Suzanne was just talking about, using the principles of IPM to apply to weeds. So we'll discuss identification, prevention strategies, and managing them with different strategies once they do arrive. So first we'll start with a quote, a great quote, reframing maybe your idea of a weed. A weed is a plant that has mastered every survival skill except for learning how to grow in rows. Now there's that sheep sorrel that Suzanne mentioned. That's potentially one of the hardest to deal with. Yeah, that is a challenging one. So let's first talk about, on that note, let's talk about what is a weed. I think we need to establish that before we move towards how to deal with them. So a weed is really just a plant growing somewhere that you didn't want it to grow or you didn't intend it to grow. Plants that are commonly thought of as weeds do share characteristics like in that they self-seed and they grow really easily with very little maintenance and care. As you can see, they just kind of sprout up and take over. So that is kind of, you can tell you can even describe a plant as being weedy, as in that it's kind of taking over and just really growing out of control. But really a weed is just something that is growing where you didn't intend it to grow. For example, these are pictures of Suzanne's garden where she did not plant the chard and kale or the borage in those spots, but they just popped up. Either the seeds blew over from another plant, or they're in her compost, and when she applied it to the soil, they popped up out of there. They just kind of volunteered to be there, and maybe she'll keep them there, but maybe she won't, because that's not where she intended them to grow. So that is her choice. And then I know an example, especially in my yard, there's, I have nasturtiums growing in my yard. I have actually calla lilies growing in my yard from someone who lived here long before I did. I don't, the nasturtiums can kind of take over. I see them in the park near my house too, just kind of taking over. Some people grow nasturtiums on purpose, and sometimes they just kind of grow on their own and take over. It's all about, do you want them there? And if not, then they're a weed and you can take them out. And on that note also, I did want to just share quickly, that not all weeds are bad. And we don't, we can kind of understand with weeds, a part of IPM is understanding our tolerance levels or our thresholds, where can we tolerate certain levels of pest before we need to take action. So I do encourage you to think about that when you are dealing with weeds. Weeds do have some positive aspects to them. Any plants growing and covering soil is usually better than bare soil. Soil does not really benefit when it is bare and, open to the elements. Even weeds growing can shade the soil and protect soil from harsh conditions like heavy rain, wind, or sun. Having roots growing in the soil, even if they are weedy roots, still, continue to feed soil organisms. They break up hard or compact soil, so they're kind of aerating soil. Some weeds can provide habitat or food for beneficial insects. And one, great thing that I saw recently that, you can think of weeds as, if you trim them before they go to seed, they're great fresh green material that if you have a compost pile, you can cut them down and add them to your compost pile and have that nice nitrogen ingredient in your compost pile as well. So just kind of something to think about as we approach our gardens. Maybe we don't have to, pull everything. We can have some tolerance for the back corner where we never go, and really focus our attention on certain areas of the garden where we want to keep nice and tidy. And I welcome you to, add any other benefits you can think of that weeds might provide. Maybe add them to the chat and share with the group. So the first step in IPM, after we've established identified the problem and decided our tolerance levels, is to identify the pest and learn more about it. So a great thing to do is to go to the UC IPM Weed Gallery. They have a ton of lots of different weeds in the state of California, pictures, and how to manage them. And we can learn what's the habitat of that weed, what the conditions those weeds like, and their life cycle, how long they live, how they reproduce. And that's going to help guide us our best and in our strategies of how to manage them. So again, we're going to learn their life cycle. Are they annual weeds? Do they sprout from seeds and only last one season or 1 year? Like burr clover, black medic, or annual bluegrass? Are they biennial weeds? These are weeds that they'll sprout from seeds. They last, they'll overwinter through the year, and then in the second year of life, they will go to seed and spread their seed and then die. So these are bull thistle, mullein, and Queen's Anne lace are some examples. And then there's the really tough perennial weeds. These are weeds that come back year after year. They grow either from seeds or from their underground parts. There can either be tubers, corms, bulbs, stems, or roots. And these weeds will last. This is pretty much any weed that lasts longer than 2 years and can come back year after year, like Bermuda grass, oxalis, and yellow nutsedge. Oxalis seems like it's an annual weed because it kind of goes away in the summer, but the underground part is still down there living and it's kind of in a state of dormancy. And every year it comes back over and over again, as you probably know. I will talk about oxalis a lot today because I personally deal with it a lot. So next, we are going to also understand the habitat in which these weeds thrive. So the cool rainy season, so the weeds we're probably seeing right now are oxalis, chickweed, and a lot of grasses. And then the weeds that we might see more in the summer months when it gets warmer are annual purslane, mallow, crabgrass, and perennial bindweed. When we know when to expect them, we can maybe put some steps in place to prevent them from coming, or we'll at least be prepared when they do come. All right, so now that we've identified our weeds and we understand their habitat, their timing, their life cycle, we can make the adjustments to make the environment less desirable. That's what a cultural control is. We're changing the environment to make it undesirable for our pest and better for our garden. So we're going to start in the soil. We're going to look at the, we can understand actually the pH of our soil just by looking at the different weeds that are growing. So some weeds prefer acidic soil like sorrel, dandelion, plantain, or stinging nettle. Some prefer an alkaline soil, chicory, Queen Anne's lace, or salad burnet. And if you see those and you understand, okay, looks like I have acidic soil because all of these plants are growing and they like that, maybe you can try to change the pH of your soil by either adding garden lime or sulfur. Those are used to change the pH. You do want to be very aware, though, of if you're doing that around plants that you want to be there, your desirable plants, because not all of those plants will enjoy that change of pH as well. So I would say that's something to keep in mind, but also applying those changes with care. Also, some weeds like nutrient poor soil that just doesn't have a lot of organic matter in it. These are going to be mugwort, thistle, vetch, sheep sorrel, and yarrow. See, again, yarrow is a great example of a weedy but very somewhat desirable plant. It grows really easily, but also and it has a lot of benefits as well. Or on the other hand, we have our weeds that like nutrient-rich soil. So lots of organic matter, lots of life in the soil will attract the chickweed, purple dead nettle, lamb's quarters, and purslane. And then another factor in our soil and our gardens to look at is the irrigation or drainage. Weeds that grow in wet or poor draining soil are going to be dock chickweed and purple loosestrife. And that's probably, most plants don't really like wet, poor draining soil. So these are probably the only plants that will thrive in that environment for the most part. And then there's weeds that prefer really dry soil, mullein, mustard, thistle. And with those, if you have wet, poor draining soil, you have these weeds that like it. You can increase the drainage. You can add organic material. You can add more minerals to just allow the area to dry up, or see why it's really wet and soggy in that area. And maybe we can change that environment. And if you have the dry soil that's attracting these other weeds, we can, add a little moisture with care to that area, and maybe it will make them less happy in that area. And then if we have hard, compact soil, there are weeds that really thrive, oddly enough, in that kind of soil. Back to the, potential benefits of weeds. If we have hard, compact soil and it's hard for us to work in it, having plants grow in it like weeds will actually help. Those roots do break up that soil. So maybe we'll, encourage them, or not encourage them, but, deal with them for a little bit because they are helping break up our soil. And then maybe we can kind of deal with them and add our compost later and add the plants that we actually do want. So yeah, so we're going to amend our soil to improve the drainage or watering holding capacity. We're going to aerate the soil to reduce the compaction. And then another question with IPM and cultural controls is kind of like, well, how did this problem arise? And a lot of times, like when you're in the garden, how did this weed get here? And if you can figure out how it got there and change that or prevent that in the future, that's a great way to deal with it, focusing on that prevention, because understanding weeds can enter your garden in a lot of different ways, on your clothes after a hike. So maybe, after a hike, you want to just, instead of going straight out to the garden, you want to put your clothes in the washer dryer. Lawnmower equipment from hired gardeners. So just talking to them about, what they're doing in other properties and if they clean the equipment first. But also some things we can't really help. Weeds do get blown in by the wind. Sometimes in plants that we buy from a nursery, the nursery, of course, also could have weed seeds blown into their potted plants, and we don't know that the weed seeds are there until we put them into our garden. And then, of course, on our pet's fur or from birds can also move weed seeds around as well. So lots of different ways that they get into our garden. Not everything we can control, but if we can kind of think about it, wiping our pet down first before letting them out in the yard, removing our, taking care of our clothes after a hike, or talking to our hired gardeners might be able to reduce moving weeds around. All right, and then I do talk a lot about reducing soil disturbance, especially when I talk about soil health, because I often, reducing our soil disturbance is actually going to lead to healthier soil. And then when I say disturbance, you get rototiller like in the picture, or just shovels, forks, foot traffic, a dog digging like in my yard. But soil that's less disturbed is generally healthier and will hold together better and lead to less erosion. And this idea can also help with reducing weeds. Often weed seeds can be in the soil for a long time, but they're kind of dormant, or the conditions are just not ready for them to germinate. They're not ideal. But when we disturb the soil, maybe bring those seeds up closer to the surface where it's warmer, where there's more moisture, or the sun is there to germinate them, that is when the weed seed, that's the environment that they like, and then they'll germinate. So if we can kind of keep those seeds down where they are dormant and the conditions are not ideal, that is going to be better. So just reducing our turning over the soil, disturbing the soil will hopefully reduce some weed germination. And a really fun way to deal with weeds and prevent weeds is to just plant more plants that you like. If you have a nice, dense or healthy growing garden, you're going to have fewer space and fewer space for weeds to germinate. Perennials are going to shade out the soil so that the weeds will germinate less. And they will also, they'll take up space. So there's less space for the weeds as well. So this is actually a really fun way to get ahead of weeds, is just by, focusing on what you do want and making sure those plants are really healthy. And as I mentioned, soil does not like to be bare. Covered soil is always going to be better, healthier soil. So that's, one benefit to weeds. But if we don't want weeds to cover our soil, we can try, again, covering it with something else, whether it's perennials, like I mentioned on the previous slide. But where in the garden where that's not possible, like we don't want to plant perennials or shrubs, is maybe your veggie garden, where you're not going to be actively planting during parts of the year, but you don't want the soil to be bare, you don't want weeds to get in. I do recommend planting cover crops. Cover crops are kind of lower cost, fast growing plants that actually add nutrients to the soil, and they hold the soil in place, add moisture to the soil, and they can, again, shade out the soil surface and take up space to reduce weeds from germinating in the soil. So some examples: crimson clover, very beautiful, can feed the beneficial insects as well. Fava beans, oats, rye, and vetch. And another great way to deal with and prevent weeds and kind of deal with them if they've already arrived is with mulch. When we're talking about mulch, mulch is anything covering the soil surface. The types of mulch that are going to give you the most benefits are going to be organic mulches like wood chips and bark or straw. Those materials are going to add nutrients to the soil. They hold in water moisture, and they keep the soil cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. But those mulches and some other mulches can also keep weeds from sprouting and growing, because it's a nice solid surface covering the soil, preventing any sun to get through, reducing our weed germination. And as I mentioned, it's feeding the soil as it breaks down, reducing soil compaction and erosion. We do want to make sure that we're always keeping mulch away from plant stems when we kind of create a volcano or a kind of a hill around our plant stems or our tree or shrub stems. We can invite disease and problems at the base of the plant. So we always want to keep the crown, or the base of the plant, where the stem meets the underground parts, that we always want to keep that clear from mulch as well. And water, thinking about water in our garden. So of course we can't control where rain falls, which is fine. We want rain to get into our soil, but water, where we water using irrigation or hand watering, can really affect how many weeds are in our garden. I do recommend drip irrigation for a lot of reasons. It does allow for really efficient, localized, and consistent deep watering, which is going to lead to healthy plants. And there's direct contact with the soil, so there's less water evaporation. The water is very localized. It's only really going to the plants that need the water, as opposed to when it's spraying all around, it's going to potentially germinate more weeds around that you don't want. You don't need drip irrigation. You can also be very careful with hand watering, but the idea is if we keep our watering very localized and focused where we need the water, then there's going to be less weeds around. So let's review our cultural controls. We're gonna understand why those plants are growing there. So maybe we can adjust the pH, the fertilizing, or just the structure of the soil with amendments. If we use our own mowing equipment if that's possible. If we're using hired gardeners, instead of moving seeds all around the place. We're going to reduce disturbing the soil. We're going to plant competitively, which means planting plants that you want and make sure they're happy and healthy. And when they're dense, they're going to shade out those weed seeds. We're going to apply wood chips or straw or bark mulch to the soil to smother any weeds or prevent germination. And we're going to water just where we want that water to go. And remember to have some tolerance in the garden as well. All right, so next, that's cultural controls. Next is mechanical controls. We often get asked, what is the best way to manage weeds? And most people are not happy to hear that our answer is hand pulling, mechanically or physically removing the weeds with your hands or tools is unfortunately the most effective and, of course, less toxic way to get rid of weeds. The key to physically removing weeds is to get them early and often. So at the first sign, any way that you can pull or cut the weed will weaken it. And if they'll probably still come back, but if you continuously keep on it, pull, disturb, cut, or just somehow disturb that weed, it's going to weaken it, and over time, it's going to stop coming back. And it's kind of later in the wet season, so maybe it's a little too late to think about disturbing when they first appear, because there's lots of weeds already in the garden. That's okay. I just want to encourage you to not be overwhelmed if you're trying to get out there this weekend. I understand how that is. I kind of let my yard go a little bit, and it's overwhelming out there, but I encourage you to just kind of focus on the areas, choose some key areas of the garden that you really want to focus on, that you really want to be nice and clean. Maybe the back corner that you never go to, you can leave that for the last part or not even deal with it. But really focus your efforts in small areas that are going to be, give you the most bang for your buck, where you really want to see a nice clean area. And to aid in physical removal, there's going to be tons of different weeding tools available to you. There is a tool for almost every kind of weed, like this one on the left is specifically for dandelions. Some tools pull, some dig out the root, and others will just slice the tops off. And so there are hand tools of all shapes and sizes, but there's also, taller tools that you can just use from standing, so you don't actually have to be on your knees the whole time. The hula hoe, which is the one in the middle, is a great tool. You can use standing, and it just kind of cuts the weed at the soil surface. Great for getting those really early weeds, just kind of chopping the top off, disturbing them right at the soil surface. And then there's, of course, lots of different kinds, kind of scary looking ones, to be honest with you, but find a few maybe that work for the weeds that you have in your yard. And then there's even some specialty heavy duty weed pullers. Hopefully you don't need these, but some people, you might, and these tools are designed to pull out really, really heavy duty perennials that are just like deep rooted. Often these are kind of used for Scotch broom, which is a really tough one to deal with. And then another kind of tool is a weed steamer or a torch. These are great for, the torch is great actually for dealing with pavers or getting weeds between cracks. Both of these tools, the idea is that they're kind of cooking the weeds, or like boiling the weeds, boiling the water inside the weed leaves, and kind of bursting them. We're not burning them, we're not setting them on fire, we're just heating them up so that they die. But for that reason, we are using heat. We do want to be very careful when we are using these. We're going to use them now, when it's cooler and very wet outside. That's going to be a safe time to use them. And we're not going to use them later on in the year when it's much drier out, because that's can put ourselves and our neighborhood at risk of fire. Another very great tools to use. See, there's lots of different kinds of tools. We can also use line trimmers and mowers to manage big areas of weeds. With both of these tools, we're going to use them early when the weeds are just approaching or just starting. We're not going to wait till they've gone to seed. Again, we don't want to use these tools once the weeds have gone to seed, because we will just be spraying seeds all around and kind of just making it a bad environment next season, or for our neighbors as well. And you don't want to pull weeds, you can employ a goat to do it. There are lots of goat for hire companies out there actually, that use goats to clear dense brush and areas that are hard to mow or hard to deal with, like hillsides. So if you have an area like this, that would be that might benefit from some grazing animals, I would encourage you to look that up. It's also really cute to see a herd of goats on the hill, like especially if you're driving by, it's really fun. And then sheet mulching. This is a great tool, great barrier for your weeds. We've talked about sheet mulching in several other webinars that, talking about getting rid of our lawns or just really helping regenerate some soil in an area that we don't have a lot growing. So this is a great way to deal with weeds because you don't actually have to pull the weeds. You don't want, seeds in there, but for the most part, you can leave the weeds there. Then you're going to cover them with 2 to 3 layers of cardboard overlapping really well. And then you are going to top that with at least 3 inches of mulch, again, of wood, bark, or wood chips or bark on top. And that is going to really smother the weeds below. And as the cardboard and the mulch breaks down, it's going to feed the soil. I did this in my yard, and I definitely got just to deal with oxalis. And I got a couple seasons of, oxalis free area. I will say I didn't keep mulching on top, which is my mistake. And some oxalis has popped through. It is much easier to pull oxalis when it pops through those lots of layers. So I'm not that worried about it, but I do encourage you, as everything breaks down, you're going to want to keep adding fresh mulch on top just to keep that suppression down. And related, I know a lot of people are interested in landscape fabrics. I do want to just share that I kind of find them to be more problematic than beneficial. Landscape fabrics are often made with harmful chemicals or made out of plastics. They actually compact the soil because they don't allow for a lot of aeration. Weeds do grow underneath them, and then sometimes if there's like a fair amount of material on top of this landscape fabric, weed seeds can land on top of the fabric and grow too. So you're kind of weeding above and below the fabric. Is not fun. They're pretty expensive, whereas, a couple of layers of cardboard you can get for free from your neighbor. Excuse me. Yeah, you can get free cardboard from your neighbors pretty easily, whereas these landscape fabrics are pretty expensive. They're kind of difficult to apply. They can cause harm to the existing plants because those plants are not maybe getting the nutrients or water or air that they would like. If your irrigation is below the landscape fabric, that's going to be problematic to repair the irrigation. And the fabrics do break down over time, and they just, break down. There's microplastics, and then you kind of have to pull it away and reapply. So I would just proceed with caution, I guess, if that's something you're interested in, learn a little bit more about it.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was so helpful. And I realized just by watching the program and all those photos, most of all those photos are weeds in my own garden. And yes, that's my weekend project, is to start tackling section by section so it's not overwhelming. But now that we can identify the weeds and we have an idea of a little bit of weed management, when we're tackling annual or biannual weeds, the best way to manage them is to hand pull them or use a weeding tool at first sight when they've just emerged. However, we always want to manage the weeds when the soil has dried, and that has not been easy because we have had rainstorm after rainstorm after rainstorm, which is a benefit. Not complaining, but it makes the weeds, us actually getting out there to manage those weeds when we have to take time and prolong our process, those weeds just get bigger and those root systems just anchor in more. But biannual and annual weeds are also really effective to use that weed torch or steamer this time of year. But again, as Charlotte mentioned, by all means, we want to avoid letting those go to seed, because when they go to seed, those seeds actually can stay in the soil for years to come and just pop up each year. And it's just, it gets to be a little nerve-wracking. And then perennial weeds, we're going to dig them out. We're going to pull them out. We're going to cut them down. We're going to mow them. We're going to use that weed torch or steamer, which those things are really cool because you can actually spot kill weeds in lawns or between your perennial or other desirable plants. So that's kind of a cool tool. But again, only during the rainy season. Perennial weeds are also very successfully managed with sheet mulching because it smothers them for a long period of time. But again, avoid letting them go to seed. Tips for weeding. We mentioned at the beginning, prioritizing the weeds. So what we'll do is, actually my husband does the first sweep, and we have a lot of cow thistle. And as those cow thistles get a little larger, they don't have to be that big, but those spines are really pokey. So it's hard to actually pull them. We physically have to get a small shovel to dig them out. But that's the priority. We'll go through and just sweep the property and just get the thistle. And then from there, we look at, okay, what's the next weed we want to tackle? Is it the, the mallow, or is it the bindweed, or, what have you. And then, sometimes I have employed my friends. I've invited them over. I've made a nice lunch and I've had nice beverages, and I've had friends come over to help me weed. I've had a weeding party, and it's a great way to get your friends out there to help you when things seem a little overwhelming. Another thing that is really fun is just put on a podcast or, an audiobook or some fun music and just take it section by section. But please take before pictures, because when you can see how lovely the section looks after you've weeded, and it doesn't have to be big, it could just be a 5x5 section, and you see that before and after, it's really encouraging. We want to really be mindful that unless we are 100% sure what that weed is and that it's not going to spread, we are going to avoid getting it into the compost unless we know it's going to be good green manure. We don't want to put any plant parts that could spread, as some of the perennial weeds that Charlotte mentioned could, or anything that could be carrying seeds. This is really important to avoid getting them in the compost. But if it's just the leafy green parts that we know are safe, it's great green manure for our compost. And something I can share, some problematic weeds that are a little scary and intimidating, such as blackberry or poison oak. When they are young, it is very easy just to hand pull them. And that might sound crazy, but I will suit up and I will definitely have my gloves on and, long sleeves and, pants and all of that. And I will pull those weeds and get them into, properly dispose of them. But then I will put those clothes, if it's poison oak, into the wash, and then wash my skin with Technu just to make sure I'm not going to transmit that those oils from the poison oak. And then weeds in turf areas. So this, looks like a nice green lawn, but I will share that it's primarily weeds. We have been working on this area a little bit. We don't put a lot of effort because we don't really mind, but it is now mostly turf area, just from years of increasing the health of it. But that is really the best way to manage weeds in turf areas, is we want to grow deep root systems. Oftentimes what we're doing is we're watering our turf areas quite shallowly, usually just about 3 or 4 inches. And that's really also favoring the root zone of the weeds. So if we could water a little deeper and then let that top few inches dry, we're going to discourage weeds. We're also going to aerate that soil, get an aerator that pulls plugs out. That's going to help increase the health of those root zones. And then we're going to rake a very thin layer of compost over that turf area. And I mean thin, like like an eighth of an inch to a quarter of an inch. That's going to allow that biology to get into the soil and help aid with the root zone health. You can also use a compost tea or liquid fertilizer. Anything that's going to then feeding that lawn organically is really going to strengthen the health of it. And then we're going to overseed through the growing season with the proper turf seed to really grow a nice, thick, lush lawn. And the whole idea here is that we're out competing those weeds. When we see weeds pop up, we just simply hand pull them. And then we're going to leave the clippings. We can adjust the mower to mow the lawn shorter during the winter months and taller during summer months. And the reason why it's shorter during the winter months is that there's shorter daylight hours. And we really want the lawn, the moisture to dry out in those between the blades to prevent fungal problems and other diseases. But in the summer months, we really want those blades to shade the root zone. So we want to have them grow a little taller. We're going to mow a little higher, and we can adjust the mowers to trim. Some of the mowers have this component where they can actually trim the clippings even finer, so they're not necessarily clods, and that's actually free nitrogen. That's free nutrients that we're leaving on the lawn. So these are all really great tips to help grow a healthier lawn, which will then reduce weeds from growing. And then oxalis. Is it impossible? Well, Charlotte has shared that by using sheet mulching techniques, it really does reduce that oxalis. I will share from personal experience, I've had the same results, but it is multiple layers of cardboard, not just a single layer overlapped, but multiple layers. And then that no less than 3 inches of mulch. Not always easy to bring the grade up that high, but if it is an area of without a lot of other plants, it is going to be very successful. But again, hand pulling at first sight, when we do that, we're reducing the energy of that plant, which then over time is going to make a weaker plant that is less vigorous. Crabgrass. This is another pest weed that we get asked about a lot. Crabgrass is very easy to manage by using a variety of cultural controls. So when it shows up in the landscape or flower beds, we're going to hand pull at first sight. So this might just sound really frustrating for a number of you. It's like, I don't want to just keep hand pulling the weeds, but remember, we're going to do it at first sight, and we're going to be really persistent at the beginning. But then we're going to protect that soil with mulch to prevent those weed seeds from germinating. And we definitely want to make sure that we have pulled the crabgrass before it sets seed. This is really important because those seeds can actually be viable in the soil for at least 3 years, and I've heard up to 5 or 6 years. So that's why it's so important to make sure that we have removed these before they go to seed. Let me just see. Oh, a question came in prior that the crabgrass had actually creeped into a ground cover of campanula. So I did consult with some professional friends and colleagues, and what we came up with, because that is really challenging. So sometimes situations are just, maybe not ideal and almost do seem impossible. We would literally have to dig up the ground cover and set it aside on a tarp and literally comb through that ground cover and pull any parts of the crabgrass, and then replant that ground cover in that area. So, and then monitor from there. If we need to do, if the crabgrass or if the weeds are creeping over from the neighbors, we can put like some type of a bamboo barrier, any type of a root barrier that will prevent weeds from creeping over. And then another thing we like to share is we don't want to plant a pest. The majority of nurseries throughout California work in partnership with the California Invasive Plant Council. That campaign is called Plant Right, and you can learn more about both of these at their websites, either calipsy.org or plantright.org. But what I'd like to share is that there's a lot of beautiful plants that have been in the nursery, in the garden centers. But then over time, we learned that they reseed very easily and become a pest. So this Heliochrysum in the 90s, it was very popular. A lot of my clients liked having the color pop of this like dusty kind of gray or the bright chartreuse green as an accent throughout their container plants or in their garden. But then years later, we learned that this was a highly invasive plant, and sadly, it is not on the market anymore, thankfully, and we are still pulling it out in sections of California. So just to share. But I'm going to finish our program talking about the chemical controls, because a lot of us do get very frustrated with the weeds and we just want to kill them. All right. So we're going to look at herbicides, and herbicides are the pesticides we use to kill the weeds. But understand that herbicides are designed to kill plants. Weeds are plants. And so we want to be really careful about the type of herbicides we choose when we're going to bring them into our properties to kill these weeds, these plants. So the first is I want to walk you through the label. It's really important to take the time to read the label and to understand what that active ingredient is and how it's meant to be used. So in this case, we have we're reading this label, we see it's a fast-acting weed and grass killer. It kills all types of weeds and grasses. It's excellent for weeds around patios, walkways, driveways, flower beds, vegetable gardens, and so forth. And the active ingredients, we could see that it's capraic acid and caprylic acid. And what we know is that this combination actually has been used in the organic ag for years. It's a really great combination that's very effective. It is registered for organic use. And as it says on the label, it does kill within hours. And on the back of the label, what we're going to see are a few more instructions. So directions for use, we want to shake that bottle well. We're going to, this product is a non-select, broad spectrum, foliar applied grass and weed killer. So non-select means that it's going to kill anything it comes in contact with, or I should say it's a contact non-select. So it's going to kill anything it comes in contact with. Broad spectrum, that means it's going to kill a very long list of plants, and it's meant to be applied as a spray, applied onto the plants as a spray. This is a concentrate. These are also available as a ready-to-use spray or also as a hose, and sometimes you can find them as a hose end, but typically we're going to use a ready-to-use nozzle spray or concentrate and then mix it with water. We're also going to see that it kills many types of weeds and grasses. This is an alternate solution to synthetic grass and weed killers. So right there, it's sharing it's eco-friendly. It does not translocate. That means it's not going to move through the vascular system of the plant or move through the root zone. So this is going to be safe for our waterways, and it won't move from one root zone to another. It is going to be rain-proof once it's dry. So we always want to see what the forecast is and apply it within when there isn't rain in the forecast for 48 hours. And I'll just share, it's also nice to make sure we're not going to have a frost, a freeze, or excessive heat. We want to be mindful of those things. And it is people and pet safe when used in accordance with the label. Because this is registered as a pesticide, we're always going to see a precautionary statement on the label. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead, a precautionary statement. So this is going to be there because this is registered as a pesticide, but we're going to also see the list of pests that this product manages. And if that pest isn't on the label, in this case, if that weed isn't on the label, then it's not going to be effective for that weed. So understanding how pesticides work, well, there are narrow spectrum selective herbicides. This means it's going to kill or manage, kill only a few closely related organisms. So only kill a very short list of plants that are closely related, okay? Broad spectrum non-select is going to kill a large range of pests or non-targeted organisms. So that's going to be that long list of plants that it will kill. Contact means it's going to kill what it touches. So it has to cover that surface of that targeted organism or of those plant parts. So if we're trying to kill a weed, we really, and it's like a dandelion in the lawn, and this is a herbicide that is a select herbicide for broadleaf weeds in lawns. It's only going to kill those broadleaf weeds, but it has to coat the leaves of that broadleaf weed, that dandelion, to be effective. The other type of pesticide is going to be a systemic or a pesticide that translocates. That means it's absorbed and it is circulated throughout the plant vascular system. Pre-emergents are those that inhibit weed seeds from sprouting or emerging from the soil. We're typically going to use these ahead of the rainy season. They're going to prevent weed seeds from germinating. It's almost like they create like an invisible film over the soil. Something to keep in mind is once we've applied these, we want to avoid walking on those areas or having pets walk on those areas, because that invisible film actually can get broken. So pre-emergents are a little tricky, and they're really for parts of the garden that we are not utilizing or get very low impact from people, children, and pets. Post-emergence, which is a lot of the products that we're looking at now, these are going to be used after the weeds have emerged from the soil. So any of the techniques actually that Charlotte has gone through, those are all post-emergent tools and techniques. And now if we're looking at herbicides, we're going to look at post-emergence. And then timing is really important. So some herbicides they kill weeds quickly. So they are like top kills, burn down the materials. So many of the eco herbicides that we see on the market are going to be these top kills. They're intended to use when those weeds are young, when they first emerge, when their root systems are young and there's not a lot of energy in those root systems. We're going to spray those weeds when the temperatures are, herbicides work really well when the temperatures are warmer, when those temperatures are above 50 degrees. We want to take advantage of the heat of the sun to help that herbicide penetrate get into the stomata, the spores of that, of the leaf tissue. If there's enough energy in the root zone, if that weed is a little bit more mature than ideal, then that weed might push new growth. Then we just apply that herbicide again. So those are going to be those quick burn down or top kills. Other weeds could take up to a week or more to actually see that weed die. These are weeds, these are herbicides that translocate or move through the vascular system of the plant. And the reason why it takes some time before we see them die is because that product actually has to move through all of those plant parts. So it could take a little bit of time, especially during the cooler time of the season. The vascular systems are not moving as quickly as they would during the warmer times of the year. And then some can persist in plants or soil for long periods of time. So again, we want to be really mindful of the product that we're using and making sure if we've used the product and we've removed those dead weeds, so they've killed the weeds and we've removed them and now we're ready to plant plants. If that herbicide is still in that soil because it persists in the soil for a long period of time, anything we plant actually can be harmed by that herbicide. And then some have active ingredients that are more likely to move through the soil and into the ground cover, into the groundwater. So that's why it's really important to, we like to encourage folks to use the eco-friendly herbicides whenever possible to avoid contaminating our groundwater or avoid having those pesticides move through the soils to possibly injure other plants. And no pesticide is risk-free. So when we're using herbicides, we want to really understand those unintended consequences of those herbicides, regardless if they're synthetic or eco-friendly, especially if we're using the DIY pesticides. We really want to be careful. We want to understand that drift is when there is any breeze that can actually move particles of that those herbicides to damage non-targeted plants. This is actually a photograph of a rose pushing new growth in around this time of the year, the late winter, early spring, but it is showing signs of herbicide, glyphosate damage that was probably sprayed a few weeks back when the plant was still looked dormant, but it was impacted by that herbicide. Herbicides and other pesticides can cause contamination of the soil and groundwater when improperly applied or overused, can damage the soil microbes. And remember, more is not better. So quickly, just a little note about DIY weed killers. These are very popular. We see them on the interwebs, these recipes of vinegar, dish soap, and salt. Well, first of all, dish soap, what we have at home is actually a detergent. And there are oftentimes ingredients in these products that are quite harmful. They can cause acute aquatic toxicity or can cause dermal reactions. So please get curious about the products you're using, look up the active ingredients and understand the impacts that they have. Salts are highly detrimental to the soil, to worms and other soil organisms. So please avoid at all costs putting salt on your soil. Yes, it can kill those plants, but it's not just killing the weeds, it's killing other things too. And if you ever want to plant in that area again, you're not going to be able to. It's going to be, that soil will be damaged by that salt content. And then vinegar. So we see a lot of horticultural vinegars on the market now, which is wonderful because they're natural. However, understand that we need to use vinegars with extreme caution. Household vinegar that we're using to make salad dressings and so forth is 5% acetic acid, not going to be strong enough to kill plant parts or weeds. 11% acetic acid, still not strong enough to kill plants or weeds, but it is strong enough to burn skin and it can cause eye damage. And then that horticultural vinegar, which is that 20 to 30% acetic acid, which we can buy in the store as a weed killer, it is actually strong enough to cause blindness and to burn a hole through our skin and very strong enough to be corrosive to metals. So please use that with caution. Please, please, please use that with caution. And then if we're really looking for something eco-friendly, understand that boiling water kills weeds. Now, of course, we want to use caution not to burn ourselves. And it's not always easy to get boiling water out to the garden. But, you know, we're going back to that steamer idea or that weed torch idea, okay? And then for more information on pesticides and their mode of action, or if you're curious about other organic or eco-friendly herbicides that might be on the market, we have two really great resources we can offer or suggest is the OMRI, the Organic Materials Review Institute, or the National Pesticide Information Center. These are both on that info sheet that I emailed out to you all, which will also email out after the program. And again, back to that weed gallery, the UC statewide IPM program has this really great tool for us that's going to help us identify those weeds so we can employ those cultural controls to adjust the weeds in our garden. And then we have a really great fact sheet on managing weeds in the garden on the Our Water, Our World website. So in close, I'd just like to share that weeds are flowers too once you get to know them. So we'd like to finish with your questions. And I know we went a little over time, but thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and attention. If questions come up later, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Suzanne at plantharmony.org, or Charlotte Canner at info@earthally.com.